Find the probability activity B is on the critical path. In this problem, a schedule includes 4 activities, A, B, C, and D. Activities A, C, and D take 1 unit of time to complete. There is a 70% chance activity B takes 1 unit of time to complete, and a 30% chance activity B takes 2 units of time to complete. The predecessor activities are also provided, and we know the early start of the entire project equals 1. From the activity table, we can sketch out a simplified network diagram, which shows activity sequencing. A detailed network diagram would include information for early and late start and finish, as well as the activity duration and float. Since the early start of the entire project equals 1, we can plug this value into the early start for all activities which have no predecessor activities. Next, we'll add the durations for activities A, C, and D. The problem asks to find the probability activity B is on the critical path. One way to test for the critical path in this problem would be to say activity B is on the critical path if the early finish of activity B is the largest or tied for the largest early finish of all activities which are predecessors to activity B. Since activity C is the only other predecessor activity to activity D, we can say activity B is on the critical path if the early finish of activity B is at least the early finish of activity C. We'll first determine the early finish of activity C, which equals the early start of activity C plus the duration of activity C. The early start of activity C equals the early finish of activity A, which equals the early start of activity A plus the duration of activity A, which equals 2. This makes the early start of activity C equal to 2 as well, and the early finish of activity C equals 3. Now we can substitute 3 into the early finish of activity C. Next, we'll solve for the early finish of activity B. The early finish of activity B equals the early start of activity B plus the duration of activity B. The duration of activity B equals 1 70% of the time, and it equals 2 30% of the time. Therefore, the early finish of activity B equals 2 70% of the time, and the early finish of activity B equals 3 30% of the time. Therefore, 70% of the time the early finish of activity B is not at least 3. In this case,